So today is Easter, and we celebrate the resurrection of Jesus on Easter. And today, every American is required by law to go to church. So thank you for coming, fulfilling your civic duty. I like Easter. I thought about this the other night. Today, all over Pensacola, all over this city, hundreds of churches in this city, across the country, everyone is talking about the same thing. And all those churches, they're all talking about the exact same thing today. Everyone who is a believer is united today, come together with the same message for the world. One message that we're all sharing today. Jesus is alive. This man lived, he died, and he lives again. That's the message. We're all saying the same thing today. It's intimidating for me to talk about the resurrection for that reason. It's the linchpin of Christianity, right? If it really happened, if Jesus really came back from the dead, if he died on a cross and then on the third day came back to life, that's the most important thing that's ever happened. That's the most important thing that's ever happened in the world. And why do I say that? Why can I make that claim? And why is every pastor in the country right now saying the exact same thing? That's the most important thing that's ever happened. Now let's look into that a little bit. So it's a given that there are a lot of things wrong with the world today. I think we all would agree. There are a lot of things wrong with the world. A lot of things that need to be made right. And a lot of people claim to know what needs to be done in order to make those things right that are not right. There are a lot of ideas out there about what should be done to the world to make it a better place. More education, more religion or less religion, more self-esteem, better technology, more sex, less sex, more work or less work, more rest. A lot of ideas. And Jesus certainly had some ideas of his own about how to change the world. Turning the other cheek, loving your enemy, some radical ideas, right? But ultimately, the difference between Jesus and everyone else is that Jesus demonstrated that he, unlike everyone else, actually had the power to do what everyone else only said they could do. People are sick, right? People are blind, deaf. There's cancer in the world. Jesus heals the sick. People are hungry, malnourished, don't have access to water. Jesus feeds the hungry. He multiplied bread and fish and fed thousands of people. People are forgotten, lonely, isolated, invisible, all around the world. Jesus seeks the lost. He sees the forgotten. He knows the number of hairs on your head. People are victims of natural disasters. Hurricanes, earthquakes, tsunamis we read about in the news. Jesus has the power to calm the storm with just a word. He has the power, right? But more than any of those things, there's one affliction common to all of humanity. One condition we all share. And while we may not be sick or hungry at the moment, we are still afflicted by this condition. Death, right? Death is the plague that has ravaged the world. And no matter what advancements we ever make, we will never cure that disease. It's the one outcome we cannot escape. Every one of us will die at some point. We will grow old and we will see others die, people we love taken from us. That's the tragedy of the world that we live in. That's the reality of the world that we live in. But the great hope that we have, most people have this hope, Christian or not, is that somehow we will see them again. Somehow we will see them again. And our friends will see us again. That somehow there must be a way for that to be true. And whether or not Jesus rose from the dead is the answer to that question. Whether there is a way. Whether there is hope for the world. Hope for us. When Jesus died, the disciples and all of Jesus' followers were incredibly distressed. They had put all their hope in this man, that he was the Messiah. They dared to believe that he was the one promised in all the scriptures for thousands of years, that he was the one who was going to set things right in the world. And then he's gone. Killed by our own people. They killed him. But then, Sunday morning, as we just read, the third day, something happens. Something unexpected. Mary Magdalene goes to the tomb and the stone is rolled away. And she tells the disciples, they can hardly believe it. Peter and John run to the tomb. And they see the clothes that Jesus had been wrapped in lying there. And they're wondering, is it true? Could it be true? Is there hope after all? They haven't seen Jesus yet, but they see the clothes lying on the floor there. Could it be true? That's a question a lot of us are asking. Could it be true? There's a great moment in this movie, Boyhood. Have you guys seen this movie, Boyhood? It came out, maybe you haven't seen it, but it won some Oscars. It came out last year, and there's this moment in it where Ethan Hawke is talking to his son, and his son asks him, there's no magic in the world, is there? No real magic. What a great question. I love that moment in that movie. And I've thought about how I will answer that question when my kids that I will eventually have, ask me that. How will I answer that question? And Ethan Hawke's character, to his credit, does not answer too quickly. Gives a, good answer. J.R.R. Tolkien, you probably know him from Lord of the Rings. He wrote Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. He wrote this essay called On Fairy Stories. It's a great essay, and in it he quotes Andrew Lang, who is a poet and a novelist. Andrew Lang said, "Is it true is the great question children ask." And Tolkien responds, he's talking about that question. He says, "They do ask that question, I know, and it is not one to be rashly or idly answered." Children ask that question, is it true? But I know that deep down, we all ask that question. The whole world is wondering, is it true? Is there hope after death? Here's what I mean. Here's how I know everyone's asking that question. I love movies. Movies are like my favorite thing. I love watching movies. And one of the reasons I love movies is because movies are incredibly insightful into the human heart. They tell us a lot about humanity, about our culture, what kind of movies we make, what kind of movies we watch, what kind of movies, explode at the box office. They reveal things about us, what we like. They stir up strong emotions in us. And those are clues as to what's going on inside, in us and in our culture as a whole. Christopher Nolan made this great movie a few years ago, if you haven't seen it, called The Prestige. One of my all-time favorite movies. I love Christopher Nolan in general, but The Prestige is probably my favorite movie of his. If you've never seen it, it stars Christian Bale and Hugh Jackman, and they're competing stage magicians in London in the late 1800s. And the whole movie explores their competition, right? They're trying to best the other one, have the better performance, the better trick, the better show. And so they go to great lengths to beat the other person. They keep going back and forth, and all this competition, and there's great costs because they're so competitive with one another. And at the end of the movie, Hugh Jackman's character gives an incredible speech. He's telling Christian Bale's character why. He's answering that question, why? Why did we fight so hard? And this is what he says. I love this. Listen to this. "You never understood why we did this. The audience knows the truth. The world is simple, miserable, solid all the way through. But if you can fool them, even for a second, you can make them wonder. Then you get to see something very special. You really don't know. It was the look on their faces." I love that line because what that is, that's Christopher Nolan inserting his commentary into the movie on the magic of cinema, the magic of movies. That even though we know magic isn't real, we know the world is solid, right? We go to the movies because we want to believe that magic is real. We want to believe there's something else out there. We want to wonder. We want something more than the natural world, something supernatural. And movies reveal to me that desire is very real in the human heart. Superhero movies are very, obviously an exploration of our desire to somehow reconnect with the supernatural. That there is a supernatural power that we can tap into to do good things, right? It's plain as day in superhero movies. And one of the marks of a great superhero or science fiction movie, if you think about it, is how convincing is it? If it's really convincing, it's a better movie. If it's so well done, so well produced, so internally consistent, we get drawn up into the story. And we get to experience the story as if it were more real. And all the wonder and adventure and excitement that goes along with that we often don't get to experience in our day-to-day life, right? The simple fact is we go to the movies to dream, to see our hopes and dreams come to life on a big budget production on the screen. But we know it's not true, right? We know that superheroes don't exist. We know the magic isn't real, that the world is solid all the way through. I mean, that's what we see, isn't it? The good guys don't always win, do they? They often don't. And the dead don't come back to life, do they? And yet, we persist in our fantasies. See, there's a dichotomy in us between what we believe is true and what we wish were true, down to the very fundamental reality of nature. Why do we do this? Why does my wife hope that a letter will arrive in the mailbox inviting her to Hogwarts? Nobody wants to be a muggle, right? I believe that the reason that hope exists is because we remember. Somewhere deep in our bones, we remember. We remember the world before the fall, before we were cut off from the supernatural, before death came in. We remember. And so we hope that somehow what has happened to us can be undone. Most of you probably know, or many of you probably know C.S. Lewis. You've heard of him. He's one of the most famous Christian apologists and authors from the past century. He wrote Mere Christianity, Screwtape Letters, The Great Divorce, among others. And he also wrote the Narnia series, which have been popularized by the recent movies. What you may not have known about C.S. Lewis is that he was very close friends with Tolkien, the author of The Lord of the Rings. They were friends for 40 years, a lifelong friendship. And Tolkien was actually instrumental in C.S. Lewis' conversion to Christianity. And so I'll tell you some of that story. So in 1931, in the evening, C.S. Lewis is having dinner with Tolkien and another professor, and they go on into the subject of mythology. They start talking about mythology. And Lewis says that myths, although very wonderful and very entertaining, they're basically lies. His exact words that when you write fairy tales, you're breathing lies through silver. But Tolkien disagreed. And the main purpose of that essay I quoted from earlier on fairy stories was to respond to this idea that fairy tales and fairy stories are lies. Tolkien basically makes this claim. I'm going to walk you through his logic, his line of reasoning. He makes this claim that that man is a sub-creator. That's his words. He says when a man creates a fairy tale, he writes a story, he's creating a secondary world. And in this secondary world, he has the ability to put into it whatever he wants, create the world however he wants. So he puts in heroes and danger and victory over evil. All his innermost dreams and longings he puts into these worlds. And listen to what Tolkien says. Every writer making a secondary world, a fantasy, every sub-creator wishes in some measure to be a real maker, or hopes that he is drawing on reality, hopes that a peculiar quality of this secondary world are derived from reality or flowing into it. See, Tolkien was expressing the idea that when we create these fantasies, these books, these movies, we do it out of a hope that somehow, in some way, it can be true. That what's true in them can be true in our world. That what we create in these worlds could be created in our world. Tolkien also says that in every great fairy tale, in every great story, there's one common trait more important than all the rest: the happy ending. He calls it a sudden joyous turn, where grief turns into joy, where the hope that's all but gone returns, and where near defeat gives way to victory, unexpectedly. And the best movies and stories all have that. They all share that. And when that moment comes, Tolkien says, something rises up in you. You feel a certain way. A satisfaction and an answer to that question, is it true? And in that moment, there's a glimmer of hope that perhaps the answer is greater than the world in which it's contained. Tolkien concludes the essay with an incredible insight that the Gospels, the story of Jesus, is a story consistent with all the qualities found in the very best fairy tales. It is, in fact, the ultimate fairy tale. It's the fairy tale we most wish were true. that love conquers all, that death is not the end, that power is given to the worthy and upright, that good in the end triumphs over evil. But the difference is that in this fairy tale, that this story of Jesus, his death and resurrection is true. It actually happened in history. Tim Keller says it like this: it's not just another myth pointing to some truth. It is the truth to which all other myths point. All other stories resonate so deeply with us because they are echoes of the story of Jesus come to earth to save the people he loves. The whole world wonders, is it true? Is there life after death? Is there a happy ending? And the resurrection provides the answer. The resurrection validates the claims of a million myths. The happy ending is real. God has created in our world the happy ending that we have created in so many novels, poems, and movies. Jesus rose from the grave, and suddenly we found ourselves in the middle of the very same sort of fairy tale we've been creating all these years. The very sort of world we wished we were in, we are now in. Jesus, when he's resurrected, he commissions his disciples in the Gospel of Mark. He tells them, go into all the world and preach the gospel to all creation. Tell everyone what the whole world has been waiting for has happened. I'm going to conclude that story. Just a few days after C.S. Lewis and Tolkien had this famous conversation at dinner, just a few days after this conversation, Tolkien explains the value of myth, and Lewis is still thinking about it. He goes to the zoo with his brother. So he's going to go to the zoo with his brother. His brother, it's kind of funny, but his brother's driving a motorcycle to the zoo, and he has a sidecar. So Lewis sits in the sidecar, and they drive to the zoo. And here's what Lewis later wrote about that. When we set out, I did not believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. And when we reached the zoo, I did. I had not exactly spent the journey in thought, nor in great emotion. It was more like when a man, after a long sleep, becomes aware that he is now awake. That conversation with Tolkien ended with Lewis finding Christ. And we know that Lewis went on to become one of the most celebrated Christian authors and thinkers of the 20th century. What a great story. My final thought is this: the resurrection is an invitation. Firstly, it's an invitation to believe. Jesus comes back to life. He reveals himself to the disciples, as we read, but Thomas isn't with him. So Thomas famously doubts, right? We call him Doubting Thomas. Poor Thomas. So he said he had to, unless he put his hands into his side and in his hands, he wouldn't believe. And then Jesus goes to him the second time, meets the disciples. Thomas is there, and he says to Thomas, put your finger here and examine my hands. Extend your hand and put it into my side. Do not continue in your unbelief, but believe. It's as if Jesus is saying to him, look, I am real. I am not a myth, not a ghost, not a superstition, not a naive religious fantasy. I am flesh and blood. Believe. I have invaded your world. Amazing. The resurrection is also an invitation into a new story, one that has a happy ending. See, we tried to write our own story, didn't we? That's what happened in the world. We tried to write the story ourselves. We followed Adam in the garden, took control of our destiny, and we lost everything. See, while we're able to make movies and write books about the way the world should be and the way we should be, we can't make it real. We can't seem to make it real. We can't make it happen in the real world. It can't get out of our books. We're supposed to be heroic and courageous and selfless and good through and through, but we're not. The simple truth is, we don't have the power. We were never meant to be the author of our lives, because there's only one author of life. And his name is Jesus. And the good news of the gospel is that Jesus, the author of life, has done for us what we could not do for ourselves. He has written the story in our world that we could not write, the one we've dreamed of and hoped for. And this new story, and with it the happy ending, is not just for him, but for all of us. Many of you are probably familiar with the resurrection story. You've probably been to Easter services. The pastor probably heard the story 1,000 times. Can I tell you anything new? I don't know. Maybe not. But here's something that's often overlooked, which I think is kind of crazy. It's easy to overlook. This is what in the Gospel of Matthew, it's only recorded in one of the Gospels. Listen to this. After Jesus dies, this is what Matthew records. The bodies of many holy people who had died were raised to life. They came out of the tombs after Jesus' resurrection and went into the holy city and appeared to many people. So Jesus comes back to life, and a whole bunch of other people did too. That's pretty crazy, right? Don't often hear that in the Easter story. Everybody's coming back to life. What's going on? What that tells me is that the resurrection is open for everyone. The promise is not just for Christ, but for all who cling to him. And that's what baptism is about, right? This afternoon, Jacob's being baptized. Great day. It's awesome. Baptism is a symbolic picture of being united with Christ in death, burial, and finally resurrection. When his story becomes our story. And while that means that like Christ we will suffer, there will be cost. There will be hardship along the way, and it may be a perilous journey. It also means that in the end, we get the happy ending we want. That no matter what comes to you in life, the end of the story, when the final page is written, you will have joy. You will have life, everlasting. A fairy tale come true. That's the promise of the resurrection. That's what Christ has purchased for us at great cost to himself. Let's pray.